thanks for introducing me. And it's a pleasure to be able to be here and present the research agenda paper. Yeah, I'm just, as you said, gonna present a paper that got out earlier this year. It's actually a collective effort that we did with the whole team. That is the Unmaking team that I'm part of, we are one principal investigator and 5 PhD candidates at Utrecht University. And kind of what led us up to wanting to look into the topic was that we collectively read the Food for Degrowth volume edited by Anitra Nelson and Werner Edwards. And while reading it and being also aware of the discussants in the field and other important publications, such as, like, some of you might know it, the paper by François Gerbet about critical agrarian studies and degrowth, we kind of decided, like, okay, we're seeing this field is like growing, and it would be just really interesting to like map it a bit more systematically. And so we conducted a literature review. In total got 46 papers, and well, not only papers, some of them are also more like popular science outputs. And our aim really was like to map the field, to find the remaining gaps, and give it a push forward, and also hopefully be able to stir some new discussions and also challenge some of the assumptions that are currently prevailing in the field. And while reading and assessing all the papers, one thing that we noticed is that the conceptualizations of degrowth vary a lot. And for those that are familiar with the degrowth debate more generally, that might be a little surprising, because the degrowth debate in itself faces the same challenge. But obviously this still has quite important repercussions for degrowth research on agri-food systems. And one thing that we notice is that many studies, they look mostly at the alignment between agricultural collectives or initiatives and specific degrowth principles. You can see some of the principles on the upper right corner, and then kind of argue for this initiative being a degrowth initiative if they, for instance, followed principles such as care or autonomy or decommodification. But if those studies only look of specific principles and not all of them together, we see a risk of a tendency of cherry picking. So we would really invite for more comprehensive analyses that think about, like, what does it mean if only one element is fulfilled, and what do the other principles of degrowth mean, which should be actually the ones that are kind of key. And this is a debate that's still to be held. We also noticed that the ecological dimension is often overlooked in degrowth studies in agri-food, because actually most of the studies look only at the social side, and I can say I'm guilty on that as well, for sure. But nonetheless, an important gap to take into account. And we also saw that there's a lack of studies that conceptualize degrowth either as a movement or a political program, but that could actually help to raise new questions. For instance, conceptualizing degrowth as a movement would bring into, or make us ask, so what alliances are there that degrowth could foster? For instance, with the sovereignty movement, how should these alliances be organized, right? What are hindrances to entering such alliances? And looking into degrowth as a political program could, for instance, point us to the policy changes that are needed to support degrowth benign food systems. And that might be, for those that are maybe more familiar with agriculture, also is really relevant in light of the unsustainability of the common European agricultural policy and the ill-incentivized subsidy schemes that are currently prevailing. But also beyond the agri-food system, what other changes in other sectors are necessary, and how would they impact actually a degrowth transformation of the agri-food system? So we can think of things as work time reduction or income and wealth redistributions, and the repercussions they have. Another avenue that we think is worthwhile putting forward is to further theorize the processes of change and processes of societal transformation in relation to the degrowth agri-food systems. And here we really call for a stronger integration of the critical social science literature on transformations and transitions. For instance, we noticed that there is a focus to mainly explore prefigurative building alternatives, but little investigation also of those elements or norms and practice and infrastructures that perhaps need to be unmade, dismantled, and disrupted, in addition to creating those alternatives, to really bring about a degrowth transformation of the food system. Yes, and we also notice that many studies focused on individual initiatives, but there are other agents of change that are really worthwhile exploring, at least in our opinion, and to look into, that they also align with the growth ideals. So we can think of other translocal networks and movements in the agricultural sphere, such as La Via Campesina. But beyond that, we also think it's important to not neglect the questions about the role of the non-human and more than human agency in transformation processes. Our third big topic then is the political economy of degrowth agri-food systems. And this is really all about the idea that we need to recenter capitalism in the debate. Currently, there's only a somewhat limited analysis of the capitalist political economy and the barrier it poses to degrowth agri-food systems. So one big topic we think we should address is capitalist cooptation, and also how we can resist, or how these initiatives on the ground can resist capitalist cooptation. How can capitalist cooptation be mitigated, and perhaps what understandings of degrowth are most resistant to being co-opted, and how can they be put forward in the dialogues with agri-food collectives and movements. And beyond that, we also argue that we need to have a closer look at how and why the agri-food collectives currently struggle with capitalism, and not only the collectives, but also other farmers and peasants. So in what ways do capitalist institutions currently act as structural constraints? And if we think about the access to land and the ongoing land grabbing and land concentration, there we have quite a straightforward example on why that is relevant to explore in the realm of agriculture. And finally, we also asked what broader political economic structures bond agri-food systems to the status quo. So in other words, how could societal transformations towards degrowth look like how, like, for instance, in terms of other sectors as well, right? Like, what are the cross-sectoral approaches that are needed? What, if we think of housing, energy, or mobility, what opportunities would be there in those sectors, and how would they need to be restructured to support a transformation of the agri-food system? So this idea that we cannot really solve and make the agri-food system sustainable or degrowth, but just changing one sector alone. And our last theme that we kind of identified is rurality and degrowth. We noticed that the vast majority of degrowth research on agri-food really focuses on the urban and peri-urban. Many case studies focusing, for instance, on urban gardening initiatives, and there's only a very limited engagement with the countryside, which is a bit of a surprise, because at least in the discourse, the role of the rural is present, but it's not really investigated in depth. So we think that we should bring in the rural more prominently, and that would raise some new questions. For instance, one would be, how can degrowth speak to rural populations, and not only speak to, but maybe also learn from and listen to the countryside. And to give some examples, maybe, some of the questions would be, how can degrowth speak to large-scale farmers who cultivate the majority of the arable land in Europe, or also thinking that actually these large-scale farmers right now are often in the public discourse presented as the problem. Could perhaps an emphasis on structural growthism mediate between large-scale farmers and environmentalists, or other more progressive forces that go a bit more in a confrontational approach right now? And similarly, could degrowth perhaps, or how could degrowth speak to those that are not really embracing progressive urban politics? So what about the middle class living comfortable lives in peri-urban areas, or what about like conservative rural small town environments? To also think about not only agriculture, but like rural more broadly. And importantly also, how would the relationships between city and countrysides look in a degrowth vision and degrowth society? Questioning also a bit this idea that all local and regional food initiatives automatically reconnect urban and rural lives. So yeah, what are really the effects of reconnecting and retailizing urban and rural livelihoods? And maybe also to go a bit beyond just staying in where we are right now. What about all the like long distance urban rural connections and the global food system that are not really transformed by local supply chains? Yeah, so those are all questions that for us are very important. And yeah, we just cluster them together in these like 4 directions. Just wanted to give here one overview again. So we really want to put forward to question and think about how we conceptualize degrowth, and how we should theorize or can more critically theorize the transformations towards sustainability, to bring in a stronger political economy perspective on degrowth agri-food systems and the role of capitalism therein, and then lastly stressing the importance of rurality and degrowth. But of course, this is a field in the go, and these perspectives are also very much shaped by our own research interests and the focus that we have adopted. So I'm really curious to hear what perhaps questions are that come to your mind that we might have not covered yet. So maybe as a last takeaway from our paper is really that we want to stress that adopting a critical social science perspective also will foreground that the present unsustainability and injustices of the agri-food system are not really only a problem of the agri-food sector alone, but also are much more ingrained in the social imaginaries about how the economies and societies are currently structured. And so this is one of the really key messages that our paper puts forward as well. And with that, I just thank you. And I think then it's Bernd's turn to be the discussant.
Excellent. Thank you for that really nice, clear overview of the paper. Thank you, and for raising lots of questions that we can get into. Thanks. So, Bernd, over to you.
Thanks a lot. Again, really enjoyed your paper. So thanks a lot for this talk. I think it's a really key discussion, and especially the topics of degrowth, the topics of transformation within the agri-food system are themes I myself am really key on exploring, and I think it's something that as CPERN we don't really have not really put a lot of emphasis on so far. So I think it's really good to have this discussion here. I think I really like all the dimensions in your paper and the various discussion points you bring up, especially the notion of bringing the capitalist dimension of food transformation stronger into the debate, and actually using degrowth as a vehicle to do that, in a way to emphasize and to highlight these capitalist root causes of the way you describe these root causes of unsustainability, of injustice within the food system. I think that's just crucial for conceptualizing a transformation within the food system. I also really appreciate in your paper the way in which you discuss a more holistic reconceptualization of degrowth and of agri-food systems that emphasizes the political dimension of degrowth while at the same time emphasizing the need for material and ecological dimensions and assessing those dimensions within research, which I think there's something to be said there, that a lot of critical research and especially a lot of social movement studies, I think, tend to focus on the alternative strategies themselves without necessarily interrogating, okay, or assessing what the actual material impact ultimately is. So in that sense, highlighting this point can really emphasize that. And then conversely, obviously, something like ecological economics can actually be very good at quantifying the impact, but then at the cost of not really looking at the political transformation involved. So yeah, in that sense, this paper can kind of work as a corrective in both ways. And then finally, I really love that you emphasize the need to look at larger networks rather than individual initiatives, because as you know, that's also kind of what I'm trying to do with my work. So yeah, I really appreciate that. But yeah, obviously this is supposed to be a discussion, so I'll have some comments on all of these points as well. So yeah, in terms of bringing capitalism into this discussion, like I said, I really appreciate it, and to do that, I think also implies looking at the power relations and the class struggles involved in changing the food system. And in your paper, you discuss that to the extent that you look at the class position of farmers in particular and kind of discussing their struggles around debt, around supply chain hierarchies, around gaining land access, like you said. But I think it's also important, maybe in addition to that, to also consider the class positions or the social identities of food consumers. Because that is also something where, access to food, access to nutrition, access to cooking skills, access to, or just the ability to use more sustainable food disposal practices, all of these things are informed by people's income, by their cultural capital, by their geographic location, not just globally, but also in terms of like what neighborhood you live in within a city, for instance. So in that sense, they're very much related to people's class background. Not to mention the fact that food provision and food preparation are also socially reproductive labor. They're very gendered. They can be very racialized. So in that sense, yeah, changing the food system is something that has all of these dimensions involved in terms of just wider society and the social power relations that make up wider society. And you mentioned middle class backgrounds as kind of targets that whose practices need to be reconsidered. At the same time, we could also argue that many alternative food practices are, if anything, too inaccessible to people from like lower class backgrounds, and it tends to be like white middle class people engaged in something like community supported agriculture, for instance. So in that sense, these are problems that I think ultimately require changing social power structures far beyond the food system itself, which you also emphasize. And in that sense, I think you argue that a degrowth perspective can help us develop this holistic understanding that this is necessary. And I would add that the reverse is also true in the sense that degrowth as a praxis is only really transformative when we look at it beyond individual sectors and actually, consider capitalist production and reproduction as a whole. Then a second point is your discussion about degrowth as a movement. And here I'm a bit, I don't know to what extent I disagree here, but I'm actually kind of curious because I don't know to what extent we can characterize degrowth as one cohesive social movement, or at the very least as one movement with agency or with an ability to forge its own distinct alliances to other social movements. Because you also describe it as a political program, and that is more how I would think about it. It is a signifier, it is a frame, if you will. It is something that can inform the thinking and the praxis of activists who are already otherwise engaged in social movements. And I think especially people involved in agri-food movements, people involved in commons networks and the solidarity economy, in climate justice activism, they are to a large extent aware of degrowth and potentially motivated by degrowth. in some way. So in that sense, I think, yeah, this question about how we conceive of social movement alliances pertaining to degrowth, yeah, I would not think of degrowth as an actor in this sense. I would think about it more as potentially a unifying concept. But yeah, we can discuss this. And speaking of alliances, speaking of networks, I think again this is very much a topic I find crucially important as well. And I think the way you discuss it is primarily in terms of yeah, this idea of alliance building and this idea of how to organize the agri-food system, or how to organize agri-food initiatives into a larger political movement. And that is very key, but I think it's also important to use this idea of networks to think about the expansion of alternative economic practices. Just in terms of the question of at what scale these alternative practices work, to what extent they can be scaled to the point where they are a sustainable economic alternative. Because my argument would be that to be truly transformative, a degrowth-based agri-food system, it still needs to be able to feed people at scale. So in a sense, relative to the capitalist economy, a degrowth-based economy still needs to grow, whether or not we want to call it that. And that's kind of a tricky question, because the word itself is fundamentally at odds with the key concept, right? So it's a question of how we can think about expansion, how we can think about consolidation of transformative alternatives in a way that is different from traditional capitalist growth dynamics. And I myself use the concept of scaling a lot in this sense, because you can think about dynamics of upscaling, meaning institutionalization, outscaling, meaning the diffusion of transformative practices across territories without necessarily growing them individually, deep scaling as a way of changing people's habits, changing people's common sense. And those are all dynamics that are alternative to traditional capitalist growth and can potentially work outside of market logics. And it's also not about necessarily enhancing volume. We can talk about scaling distribution dynamics, scaling the accessibility of alternative food systems, scaling the democratic participation within the food system, and the degree of ecological regeneration that it provides. So in that sense, all of these crucial principles of degrowth can be thought of in terms of what their scale is and at what scale they can be effective. Yeah, which I think is also practically instructive, because that way you can yeah, kind of strike a really productive discourse, I think, between research and practitioners that I think would be very helpful. And yeah, those were kind of my comments. Again, thanks a lot for this article, and thanks a lot for getting me to think about these things again. And yeah.
Yeah, thanks for engaging it with it in such depth. That's always very nice if someone really reads something. I don't know how it works. Do I now respond to your comments first before we open, or?
It's optional, but if you're ready to respond now, then it sounds like a good opportunity.
Sure. Yeah. No, because I think all of the points that you raised were really relevant and really important. So maybe for the one on bringing in capitalism and the need to also look at the class positions of food consumers, I completely agree. And I also agree that we don't do that sufficiently in the paper. We don't hint at it sufficiently in the paper. I think there are some openings where you can read it between the lines, where we call for, okay, right, we actually need to think about income redistribution. We need to think about wealth redistribution, how that actually yeah, and could potentially enable other people to join that are currently not able to join, but we don't really look at the other cultural aspects that you've also hinted at, or like that you have actually now developed way more. So that's why I'm saying it's like our research agenda is definitely not complete, and it's very nice to see that, yeah, instantly there are new questions that can be added and that are actually very aligned with what we have called for, right? And I think indeed the food system, as you said, will not be transformed only by addressing the struggles on the production side, but also we need to be very aware of the consumption side. And as well, I'm also working at community-supported agriculture. That's also one of the key challenges they are currently having, right? Like being only catering to rather educated middle-class backgrounds, not speaking the right language and not being able. So in a sense, here it's actually also maybe interesting to see it's not really that degrowth degrowth is facing a bit the same challenges, at least from a discursive perspective. So in a sense, here it's like, if they are on the discursive perspective, failing to attract, it is actually the political level where there might be the margin to change these things. Yeah, and then for the degrowth as a movement, I think I get that comment a lot on people being unsure whether degrowth should be considered a movement or can be seen as an actor. Together with a colleague, actually, we wrote a paper where we conceptualize degrowth as a movement and explore this idea of alliance building. So I completely see where this comment comes from, because contrary to some other more clearly defined movements or social movement organizations, degrowth doesn't really have this unifying, like, one address where you could just ring a bell and be like, okay, so we want to build an alliance. It's a bit unclear who the people are that really stand for it, who can speak for it. So part of the critique is definitely valid, but I do like a lot also how Matthias Schmelzer puts it, that it's a movement in the making, or the degrowth spectrum, so that it actually is developing into the direction of becoming a movement, which, for instance, I attended the Degrowth conference in Zagreb this summer, and also there they now not only have the Degrowth assembly anymore, but they actually become more and more organized as Degrowth. So they are actually trying to also in their strategies not only produce like because that's one of the things, okay, degrowth is more of a discourse, more of some ideas, it's not practical, but they are actually trying to change that as well. So in a sense, I would say, yes, to some degree, you're right, but also I would expect that it's changing into a different direction where they're actually more and more becoming consolidated as something that we can analyze as an actor, or yeah. So, but also when talking to people within the CSA movement, they completely share your interpretation of it, which is actually something that we saw as really a huge barrier for this idea of building alliances, because if people on the ground that are working with like alternative models of agriculture don't perceive degrowth as a movement, then there is a lot of work that needs to be done before such alliance building can actually materialize. Yes, and then your point on scaling, yes, I also do like the concepts of like scaling up, scaling deep, and the varieties it gives. So I do think that's something that is useful. On the other hand, I also think it's important to stress that even in a degrowth society, there are some things that need to grow, and that's sometimes a kind of misconception of what degrowth wants, because sometimes, I mean, people would be like, so you want to degrow healthcare, or there's obviously certain things where degrowth scholars, degrowth activists are very strongly saying certain sectors need to grow, and certain geographic locations maybe growth, even economic growth may still be necessary. So yeah, so my response is like, yes, we can integrate it, but yes, we should also really think about what are the things we want to grow and what are the things we need to degrow. and not just shy away from growth as such. Yeah. But I get the point.
Excellent, thank you. Good. Bernd, you may have some things you want to come back on that, but maybe just hold them for a minute and I'll open the floor and see if anybody else has any comments or questions they want to bring in at this point. Yeah, please, Mladen.
Hi, I didn't prepare for this. I was more stimulated by the silence, as I think both our authors or presenters don't deserve such a silence. So can either of you, primarily Leonie, I think with the original analysis, comment on the food self-provisioning, which is pretty widespread in Central and Eastern Europe, not as a replacement to an agri-food system, but as a strange complement which shares a lot with degrowth principles, if not in a movement. I'd be interested to hear just first reflections or comments, and if you want, I will later expand on what I mean by FSP, but it's usually this over 50% grow your own beyond just urban gardening.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I immediately think of the work from Peter Jellicoe in this regard, who talks about quiet sustainability as a way of, yeah, I guess pointing to practices that are often a bit like sidelined or overlooked because they are not this like radical, very, yeah, and in a sense, like, have it already spelled out what they stand for and that it's very political, but they're more like maybe a bit more the practices that are nonetheless super important and provide a lot of ground, but that are not as conscious per se. And I do think it's super important to highlight those and to think about what we take from them and how perhaps so on the one hand, of course, there may need to be politicization processes that go hand in hand. So of course, like quiet sustainability is some elements that may be very necessary, but may not be enough to bring forward a degrowth society that actually wants this more political consciousness. But nonetheless, yeah, I think it's really important to not neglect them and not be very arrogant and overlooking them, because sometimes if you look at the ecological dimension as well, then they can be actually very interesting supplement, and they also have a lot of the, if you look at the relations that we postulate for degrowth, such as care or reciprocity, you can find a lot of them. And I guess you think of something like allotment gardens, and yeah, I think those are the examples of the food self-provisioning.
It's allotment and it's peri-urban growth, but beyond just it's got, and you have a lot of that in Jechlich's work, it's anti-hegemonial because it's resisting the system, and it's building on autonomy. And these are cultural aspects of degrowth that we perhaps don't find enough in the I don't know, Central European movement analysis books, but that you find more in French literature, that degrowth isn't just about asking for a political strategy, it's also a cultural change, which is perhaps more subtle. But I don't want to take your time. The reflection was what I was hoping for. Thanks.
Okay, I've got one in the chat, so I'll from Alia Kiran, whose microphone isn't working, I think, so I'll read it out. So more of a general question, but can you comment on the regions that this literature has tended to focus on? For example, is much of the literature focused on Western Europe and the US, in other words, the global north, or are there literature trends in terms of how the conceptualizations of food systems of the global north and south that are beyond exploitation concepts? Thank you. So where is it focused, and is there a discussion of the dynamics in terms of the relation between the global north and the south?
Yes. Sadly, I have to say that most of the literature did focus on the global north. There are some works that, for instance, look also at the role of Cuba, and then Cuba is kind of the example, I think, that at least that comes directly to my mind. And yeah, it would be in terms of what lessons can you learn from the case of Cuba in terms of degrowth transformation of the agri-food system. And otherwise, I have to say that that's actually a limitation that we kind of clearly state in the paper, that our focus is quite European, Western European also, because this is the literature and the debate is mostly developing there, and also this is where we as scholars are based, at least our research institutes, and we all engage with case studies in these areas as well. So we definitely acknowledge that these debates, that we're not covering maybe important points of the debate if we would think of them through a global south perspective, but we did try to at least bring in also the importance to think about issues such as decolonization, that this is something that is relevant even if you study it from a context of Western Europe. This is a question you will need to like face. Yeah.
I may follow up on that. I'm kind of wondering, to what extent do you think that is kind of just a feature of the degrowth literature in particular? Because thinking about the food system literature, I mean, the literature on food regimes is very much international and looks at global value chains and global power relations. And there's a ton of literature on food sovereignty movements in the global south. So that topic, from specifically the agri-food perspective, is inherently very international. But I have heard critiques of degrowth in particular as being kind of more global north centric. Is that am I perceiving that correctly, or?
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely at least as a recurring critique to degrowth. And I guess there are also, so there are some people that are trying to bring it more actively also to other spaces, but there's also this idea of, okay, so there are other concepts that maybe are way more appealing. Like if we think of Latin America, maybe the concept of buen vivir is actually something that resonates way more than the ideas and concepts around degrowth. So in that sense, the question is also if degrowth needs to be the reference point for like beyond Europe. Maybe not, but maybe it's still interesting from an analytical perspective to think about like how to more strongly integrate then what it means to be degrowth from a more like perspective where you take into account also more like maybe different regions, the geopolitical developments that are taking place. So in that sense, but exactly, like if you think of also the discussions about like food sovereignty and degrowth, they are written from scholars that then kind of focus again on Western Europe, while food sovereignty as such obviously comes from way more from the global south and has its roots there. So yeah.
Thank you. Rob?
Hi. Sorry. Hi, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Leonie. I really like your paper. I read it not long after it came out, and I found it really generative and useful to work with. And I think the questions that you raise are hopefully questions that I'm able to answer through my own work. Not least this idea that we need to be looking more at industrial or conventional forms of farming when we're talking about these questions, and not solely at sort of alternative, however you want to conceptualize it, modalities. I'm interested to press you though, or ask a little bit, and I appreciate that it's a co-written paper and you may not have been responsible for this section, and this may not be something you want to speak on, but on the section that, and you mentioned it in the presentation, that talks about different ways of conceptualizing the more than human world and more than human agency within this sort of rubric. And my inclination towards historicization and political economy slightly chafed a little bit with maybe some of the approaches that you were talking about in terms of these kind of flat ontologies and by quoting Latour and Haraway. And I thought that maybe is a little bit of a tension in the paper, given some of your other sort of political economic incitements to think historically and materially about some of these questions. I wonder if you could, to be fair, most of those are just questions and provocations in the paper, but I wonder if I could draw you a little bit to discuss that and the discussions that went into that section and how you may see that emerging in the agenda to come.
Yeah, spot on. That is one of the sections that I'm fearing most of a reviewer will ask about it in my thesis defense, because indeed that's actually the section that I contributed least to. So could you maybe just rephrase your question once more, just so that I can think about it once more?
Do you think, perhaps I can ask you, do you think that the approaches that I mentioned that rely on Latour or Donna Haraway are the best approaches to integrate a sensibility, an ecological sensibility into some of these discussions of agri-food system?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think I have a good answer to that, because I'm just not familiar enough with the literature itself. So yeah.
You can give us your thoughts, Rob. It sounds like you might be skeptical about that.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's this incitement or this encouragement to think about the relations of capitalism and the historic trajectories which have produced the kind of dynamics in agri-food systems which necessitate growth and tend towards intensification and what you might want to call alienation, are not best considered via maybe some of these approaches which look to blur the lines between the human and the non-human. I'm not saying that this, I'm not reinforcing this dualism necessarily, but I'm inclined towards people who think more strategically about forms of analytical dualism like Andreas Malm or John Bellamy Foster. Again, it's contentious stuff and people talk way too much about this, perhaps, but no, I think I'm a little bit skeptical of integrating some of those into these sort of pathways, because I think they articulate and already do sort of emerge with some of the facets of advocating for alternative food systems, which can tend towards what could be controversially sort of termed romanticism, which tend to just advance ideas of care and conviviality over necessarily transformations, and also sort of reduce the fact that the systems which we have are now deeply entangled, as they recognize, but as a result of historical processes that you also encourage us to name when we're analyzing agri-food from a degrowth perspective, which I think is super important. So no, I mean, it's quite tricky to off the cuff it, but those would be my initial sort of skepticisms. And that's something I'm working on it personally as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing this. It was really interesting. And something to consider for, I will bring it back to my research group.
So we do need to have more strong notion of a duality of humans and nature then, is that what we're saying? I mean, if we go
not necessarily a dualism, but at least an attention to the historical sensibilities that intensify alienation, perhaps, to put it that way.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. Great. Am I allowed to ask the sort of most basic question, which is what is degrowth? Because when it seems like we still haven't necessarily pinned down, there seems to be like a narrow definition and a much broader definition. The narrow one seems to be much more about sort of creating alternative systems of production and so on that are probably not so engaged with the capitalist economy or the state. And then when you read like the Degrowth and Strategy book with Nathan Barlow and a long list of other authors, the discussion seems much, much broader than that. It seems to be almost a kind of argument for a more equitable type of society. And that can include things like universal basic income, which you mentioned in the article as well, and with perhaps a clear role for the state. It also includes things like trade union organizing to try to get more equitable sections of the capitalist economy. And from that, in that sort of reading, it's a much broader concept that really can be extended to any form of praxis that's trying to create a more equitable society. So I wonder if there's a question of definition, especially thinking about it as a social movement, whether there's a need for a tighter definition rather than perhaps a more narrow and a more broad one, and they perhaps both get used at the same time. That would be how I read it anyway, but I may have read it incorrectly in terms of what it actually is.
Yeah, no, I think so. Again, well, I like their work a lot, but like I think Schmelzer does a really nice job in showing the different strands within the degrowth debate, and also how they frame basically what degrowth is, what the problem is that degrowth addresses. Like basically, if you think about degrowth as being both like a critique and a positive vision, what elements does this entail? And yeah, I would say, and it's funny because you can read things, or like you can find papers that will argue, one paper arguing that, oh, but from Jason Hickel, so famous degrowth author, degrowth is decolonial per definition. And you will also find papers that say like degrowth is not decolonial enough, or is like some strands are not at all entering this debate, right? So you do have this problem of depending on where you are or where people position themselves in the degrowth debate, you can get very different answers. And specifically also like me coming from the context of Germany, you also have it, you even have different, like you have degrowth and you have post-growth, right? Like also in the English one, as two different terms that are also still differently connotated. So I can also give you how we define degrowth, and I think we really try to make it go beyond the basic definition and give a definition that thinks about, even if when you critique growth, that it's not only about economic growth that you critique, but it's also all the cultural aspects that come with it, or like this idea of that very internalized growth paradigms that we have in our head. But it's something that it's kind of like how to foster that in the field, right? Like how to foster a tighter definition. How do you reach this consensus when you have coexistent definitions already, right? And you have that, and also that's one of the things that we point out with the conceptualizations, that you have so many ways how you can define degrowth, and that becomes quite problematic actually when you study something, because we took the example of the principles, but your examples is equally valid, and it's something just that where we really need this academic debate, but I don't really think there will be a consensus that will be reached at some point.
No, that's good. So it's more like an approach in a way of thinking and a set of goals rather than a tightly defined intellectual statement. And
well, you find these definitions, but then you will find just coexistent ones.
Right. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Alice. Anybody want to come in at this point?
Maybe to follow up on that, I am kind of wondering, in terms of turning degrowth into something that is more practicable for social struggle, for social movements and so on, I am at that point wondering how how strictly defined does it really need to be when we're considering that many social movements, especially working around agri-food struggles, they're pretty much used to having conceptions that are relatively vague or relatively iterative, or that they interpret in varying ways, including food sovereignty, including community-supported agriculture, including agroecology. These are all very malleable concepts, and I don't know to what extent they need to be completely uniform, considering how decentralized these movements are, considering how much emphasis they place on autonomy and so on. But yeah, maybe that's a strategic question.
Mm.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. I mean, one is, like, of course you're right that they can be malleable, but the question is, like, what do you get if you have a perhaps more openly anti-capitalist framing of degrowth when, for instance, entering an alliance, right? So you will get, degrowth can be useful in different ways depending on how it is framed or how tight it will be presented. And I think especially, for instance, for the CSA movement, that could be something that could challenge them most in this regard. And on the other hand, from my experience with alternative agri-food movements, I've seen that actually they don't even care whether it's called degrowth or solidarity economy or commons, right? For them, it's like, okay, these are all somewhat related ideas and concepts that support largely what we are trying to do here. But if you call it degrowth or commons, for us, it doesn't really matter. That's kind of an ivory tower discussion that we are not so interested in. And we rather care that this is something that can maybe have become more prominent in the overall discourse, so that people will want to join us, right? So, yeah.
Good answer. Yeah, good answer. Okay, good. We normally aim for about an hour, so this is your chance, if you haven't asked your question yet, to get my attention somehow, so that you can do. Otherwise, maybe I'll give the speakers a final minute to sum up, or final remarks. Bernd, do you want to go first?
I pretty much said all I wanted to say, so yeah, I'll just leave the floor to Leonie.
Okay, then in that case, can I ask one last question as a prompt to your closing remarks? Because I was,
Sure.
when you're discussing the notion, like the idea of lack of engagement with, well, I'm not actually sure actually, because you said that there was, I think you said there was a lack of engagement with a kind of critical political economy perspective, and especially the limits or the obstacles created by capitalism. But at the same time, it sounds like a lot of the definitions that we've talked about of degrowth, or the discussions of degrowth, have been quite aware of a degrowth agenda being a challenge to pressures coming from capitalism. So I wonder how much there is a lack of engagement. But more generally, my question was around the fact that when you were describing that question of the obstacles created by capitalism, I got the impression that you might have been saying, really, it's a bit, the chances of its realization are less than the advocates of degrowth would like to think, because capitalism is going to prevent it from happening ultimately. So do you have that kind of skeptical position towards degrowth, in the sense that it's a bit naive around the obstacles created by capitalism, or how do you see that interaction between capitalism and degrowth? And also, any final remarks that you want to make?
Yeah, no, I think maybe here it's just also not clarity, because what we talk about mostly in the research agenda is really, we try to look at the intersection of degrowth and agri-food studies. So while I think degrowth studies have been much more maybe explicit about those barriers and the obstacles in the application to the agri-food system, or studies that really want to use a degrowth lens on agri-food. There it has not been that prominent. And therefore we say, okay, but that's actually something that could be integrated way better, and actually from both sides. I mean, you also, if you look at critical agrarian studies, you also have these analyses. So if they're there from both sides, why is it lacking when we look at them together? And is that not something we should do? So and for my own, is degrowth naive? Well, I wouldn't say it's naive, but it is also a true struggle, right? Like, it's not something that will come easy. So, and especially in the context of polarizing societies today. So in that sense, I think there's just a very long way to go. And yeah, maybe that's a bit like broader than actually answering the paper, but on the one hand, while degrowth is gaining strength and also the same with alternative food movements, they're growing in numbers, but the agro-industry is becoming more and more consolidated. And similar with degrowth is gaining strength, but at the same time we see populist movement on the rise, far-right movements on the rise. So it's also but like quite a difficult assessment then to make on what it means in the overall picture. But so if they're gaining strength, but the overall tendency of society goes into a different direction, what does it mean for us?
Yeah, no, it's
so,
true. It's polarizing. Yeah, no, great. Thank you. That's really great. Thanks for bringing this paper to us, for writing it, and for sharing the main points and giving us a chance to discuss it. It's been really good to hear that, and also to have a chance for us to hear the contributions from Bernd as the discussant and from the floor, and the interaction, because it's much easier to get a grip on the ideas that you're talking about when we can talk about them rather than only read them. So thank you for that. I'll put a link there of our website where we'll put the recording of the discussion at some point, and you can also see the future events as they come up. The next one that Bernd has organised, because Bernd is the convener of this, but I'm just chairing because he's a discussant this time, is on 26th of October, Toward a Political Economy of Synthetic Data, a data-intensive capitalism that is not a surveillance capitalism, ? So watch this space for that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Leonie. Thank you, Bernd. I think that's probably everything.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks.
Thank
Great.
you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Yeah, see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.